right? The notion of fitna, this critical word. Fitna would best be translated as what?
Strive for dissent.
Dissent, strife, discord, even heresy could be fitna, right? He says, oh, this is all, and in Wahhabi, if you've engaged any Wahhabis, you can't have a conversation without hearing the word fitna like a gazillion times, right? And this is all fitna because the speculation, speculative reason takes you away from the physical to the metaphysical, and who knows what comes out in this world of the metaphysical or the paranormal, if you will. And same thing for and one of the most fascinating, I think, from an anthropological point of view, fascinating parts of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab's text is where he says that I don't even like, if it hadn't been for the fact that the Prophet used to listen to poetry and enjoy it, I would have banned poetry. Because he says, look, these poets, they excite the imagination. They get young people all excited about chivalry and horses, and this is in his actual text, and women and showing off and all types of dangerous things could creep up from all types of fitan, the plural for fitna, could creep up from this poetical, and may God forbid we even have poets who we will forever speculate as to their face, like Ibn al-Ma'ri, the very famous poet. A lot of his poetry seems to quite heretical, and of course, Ibn Taymiyyah, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab has no qualms about saying that Hallaj, the famous Sufi, is a heretic and an unbeliever. But Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, in his Risalat al-Tawheed, goes even beyond and produces a list of people from the Islamic tradition that he says are all unbelievers, heretics. And that if he would have encountered them in his lifetime, he would have been happy to execute them. And in fact, the Wahhabis did execute all the Sufi and rationalists. But on this list are some, and this is again one of the things that if people just read, some very surprising names, including people like Fakhr al-Razi, the famous rationalist-oriented theologian. But even Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab condemns even al-Ghazali with all the position that sort of Ghazali adopts as sort of the antithesis of Averroes, right, Rushd. But according to Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, even a guy like al-Ghazali his face is suspect. And as far as now, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab ultimately, when the Wahhabis start expanding and so on, they come to the question, well, who do we count as Muslim or not? They go back to the writings of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and they say, well, the vast majority are not Muslims unless they prove by material conduct their Islamic belief, and only by the material conduct, right? And so one of now, why Ghazali? Why does he even think like Ghazali? Because we normally in graduate students in Islamic studies learn that Ghazali is antithesis of Averroes. Well, if you try to read Ihya Ulumuddin, you remember the renewal of Islamic sciences, right? Ghazali's famous treatise on theology. Ghazali produces a lot of narratives, a lot of mythology, a lot of historical stories that constantly that have a particular impact, and that is to increase to decrease the dependence on the material world, and increase independence from the material world. So Ghazali, for instance, talks about how eating too much is really being obsessed with food, being obsessed with anything physical is not good, and he produces all these narratives that are increasingly telling the laity that your attitude should be one of spending much of your space with the metaphysical or the non-material. So in his chapter on remembrance of death, for instance, he says, look at the world of existence. Your actual engagement with the material world is relatively short indeed, and other than that, as far as we know, you exist in non-materiality. If the barzakh, the state you're supposed to be in after death, is non-material existence, and in the hereafter, every indication is that it's a non-material existence, and so Ghazali says that the lay people cannot. They need stories. They need the tool, the equipment of mythology to be able to increase the level of knowledge as to the non-material. So, and Ghazali gives them that. He says, okay, here are all these mythological narratives about there once used to be this person. And he actually says, a child likes to hear stories, and we grow up, we like to hear 1001 Nights and Harun al-Rashid, and and he says, well, this is not a bad thing, but this is just how lay people are. And he says, well, as the more sophisticated you become, then you can rely on reason, or what he prefers, intuitionism, for certainty, for knowledge. So he says the laity will always just, so the most is you need to try to purify their inclinations, improve their dependence on the senses. Actually, Ghazali in Ihya Ulumuddin has this wonderful passage where he says, that God sometimes breaches the material world to demonstrate the existence of miracles, to show us our potential. And so he talks about a blind person who sees everything, and a deaf person seems to hear everything. And he says, basically, well, this person is superior to a person who depends on his eyes to see, or depends on his ears to see. But it is only after going through many trials and tribulations that this blind, deaf person attained this level of a extrasensory perception of adilla, of the indicators, and the ability to have knowledge of the non-material without even using the material, or knowledge of the material without even depending on the material. So that person can know that there is a camel over there or a horse over there without even seeing that horse. Just and he said, but look, this person went through a lot of hardship and suffering to get to that point. Most people cannot be expected to if they're tested the way this exceptional person is tested, they would crumble. And so there are those who can persevere through a lot of hard work and get to this point of intuitionism. And remember, Ghazali starts out as a rationalist. He starts out as a person who actually believes in reason and then migrates to a person who believes in intuition. And importantly, Ghazali says, within intuitionism is the universality of the call of Islam. So for Ghazali, what is submission? Submission is a relative state where you see the truth for what it is, and the truth, i.e. your migration towards certitude, and this migration towards certitude, you become less and less dependent on the material existential world, more and more empowered in the spiritual world, and ultimately you are breaking the barriers between the physical and the metaphysical world during your lifetime, something that completely disappears in the hereafter. But the Ghazali's migration towards, when you read about Ghazali's migration towards mysticism, and especially his biographical, self-critical essay towards the end of his life, is that he says, I realize that reason is faulty because it ultimately it is too dependent on the physical world, while spiritualism is superior because it can negotiate the material world, but it can reach the non-material world. Now, notice here the idea of Islam again, okay? Submission. It is quite common to read or to encounter this notion of submission is basically a notion of obedience. And it comes from the word ta. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. It comes from the word ta, right? Ati Allah wa Rasuluh. Huh?
Yes.
And so obeying God and the Prophet, or it's repeated several times, Ati Allah, Ati Rasul, or Ati Allah wa Rasuluh, and it just depends on. And so it repeated several times. But now we ask, or the sort of perennial question of Islamic theology, if your will is to obey, how can you obey without first knowing what is it that you're supposed to obey, right? So obeying begs the question of knowledge. And of course, the Ahl al-Hadith or the Zahiris said, well, knowledge, the epitome of knowledge is textualism, is this, But actually, this is, if you remember, the Zahiris, and the literalists nearly became extinct in Islamic history. I mean, they became extinct in Andalus before its fall. and they became extinct. Sufism at one point represented 90% of actual beliefs in the Muslim world. And the Hanbalis nearly became extinct until the Wahhabi revival. I mean, even Arabia itself, where the last stronghold of the Hanbalis, had mostly converted either to Ja'fari, Shi'is, or to Maliki. And that's why if you go to Kuwait today, you find a lot of people who are Malikis. And you say, oh, how is that? You know that Kuwait basically is a tribe that migrated from Arabia to this area. Well, because most of Arabia had, and what Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab did truly is bring to life this literalist school, this existentially oriented school that had nearly become extinct. So then it is the knowledge, the dependence of text for the notion of obedience is quite limited, because the text itself is part of the material world, and it opens up a potentiality but doesn't fulfill it. So for instance, in numerous you find numerous theological treatises on the Quranic passage on light upon upon God being the light of the heavens and the earth, and God being light upon light, and so on. And a lot of the theologians say, well, if you are a literalist, how can you even start to understand such a Quranic text, or Quranic text that talks about God being closer to you than your jugular vein, or God being with you everywhere and yet in the heavens, and so on? How would you even start it? And they say, well, it is the text is only beginning, it is not the end, but ta'ah, let's put it in the hypothetical, this way it brings it easier. If a person obeys the text, right, and the literal text, but his heart is full of doubts about God, the hereafter, the whole thing, compare that person to a person who is, doesn't commit any major sins. We're not talking about someone who, blows off 5 daily prayers or 40 days or whatever. But his heart, his soul is content with certitude about God. The hypothetical question, which of these has achieved greater submission to God? Right? The Wahhabis, their answer would be, well, the problem is that this person, the first person, should stop doubting, and he thinks too much. Their answer is, bila kayf, don't ask how or why. That's a famous phrase, bila kayf. Don't ask how or why. If you have doubts, it's because you think too much. And so if you learn not to think, you'll be fine. But most Islamic theological orientations would clearly have said that the second person has achieved greater submission than the first person. That would not have raised any controversy in Islamic discourses until the puritanical resurgence. Now, so the highest form of possible submission is when you realize that because God is your Lord, then your you're associating partners with God. In other words, accepting a relationship in which you are subservient to anything or anyone but God is a compromise in your faith. That's the highest level of Islam, where basically you have internalized so fully the certitude of God's relationship with you, and you actually see God as a qareen, as a partner, who's so close to you in everything you do. It is not your material senses that are going to you're going to be depend on, but you're going to rely on non-material or metaphysical awareness, whether it's reason or intuition or spirituality. That has always remained the debate within theological schools, but that it becomes to the point that you completely believe and here look at the relationship to sexuality, the Quranic text where it says, if the whole world wants to harm you in a way that God does not permit, it will not be able to do so. And if the whole world wants to benefit you in a way that God does not permit, it will not be able to do so. So to actually live that out, to actually become the embodiment of that relationship, would, and here among the people, the school of thought known as the intuitionists, literally, or the the school of illumination in Islamic theology, they always always emphasize the traditions that say, well, and which Hallaj, by the way, belonged to, that if the tradition of the Prophet, if you wish to know your Lord, know yourself, or that if you know yourself, you see nothing but the Lord, and so on. The whole set of traditions that create these potentials, that in the same way that the line between the physical and the metaphysical starts to disintegrate, the line between the temporal and the divine disintegrates to the point where in Islamic, especially in the theology of illumination, in this is true autonomy. They talk about this is true freedom. This is when you truly become free. Is when you just look at your dependencies on everything, including not just your own desires and so on, but also on other human beings, are conquered. But even if you are not within the school of illumination in Islamic theology, all Islamic theological schools, except for the puritanical orientation, accepted to one extent or another the premise that there is this proportional relationship. The more you truly submit to God, the more autonomous you become in the temporal world. In other words, the relationship, I put it again in the hypothetical, they would always ask, is submission to God make you a weaker human being or a stronger human being? How many Muslim theologians would say, oh, it makes you a weaker human being? I mean, and even the Wahhabis would say, just don't ask the question. It's not that they would say, they would just say, that's speculative, that's hypothetical question, don't ask it. So that's the response. But every Muslim theologian that I'm aware of said, no, it makes you a stronger human being. Well, the question is, okay, I'm sorry? The question is, how does submission make you stronger unless it involves, because no, we're not talking about physically stronger. Perhaps if God, decides to make you this, Hulk, then maybe you become physical. But most people, God doesn't desire to make them Hulk, and doesn't guarantee them anything in the physical world, because ultimately, remember, the Quran tells the Prophet himself that the more you submit to God, the less we promise you as to the riches of this world. So it is and therefore, and that's why most, not actually all, except the people who say don't ask, say, well, it is this sense of strength. It is not a physical equation. It is either a felt reality, a theoretical state, or a spiritual state, depending on your school of theological thought. Whether you see it as you become a sort of an autonomous, like an Ibn Sina who argued that you realize the truth of things and you reason through it, and so you see all the falsehoods disappear before your eyes, or on the other side of things, Abu Hayyan al-Tawhidi, who says, no, as the divide between the temporal and the divine start fading before your eyes, that your spirit itself, your consciousness, your knowledge of the world, which he defines as consciousness, a state of consciousness, it becomes in a different a paradigm, in a different state altogether. So, and in fact, Abu Hayyan al-Tawhidi has a fascinating discourse about why is it that mystical masters, for instance, or masters of Sufi masters, the Aqtab and so on. Why is it that these people who are advanced in spirituality often have people who are very materially dependent or very dependent on the physical world, have a hard time understanding them? And he says, well, because they're different states of consciousness. It's as if they exist in different planes of reality, except that one plane of reality of the mystics, they had to go through the physical plane of reality before they reached higher consciousness. So the only Abu Hayyan al-Tawhidi, in his view, that the commonality is that the mystic understands the other consciousness as a previous consciousness, as the infantile consciousness, which the mystic had evolved beyond. Okay, let's take let's take a break.
Your question, but just while we're through, so the more advanced consciousness, obviously, because it recalls the earlier stages of growth. And those earlier stages, you're sort of making parallel more or less to this materialist approach to life and to religion. Like, in a sense, the kind of materialist or the Wahhabi theological materialist view is, in that point of view, is kind of an earlier stage. Is that what's at that earlier stage?
Well,
kind of immature belief based on...
It's not, because the analogy that is